welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. We're just going to give folks a little bit of time to come in from the waiting room. We've got a lot of people on this call for today, so welcome. I am Amy Jamrog. For those of you who don't know me, I'm with the Jamrog Group here in Holyoke, Massachusetts. I am a financial advisor and have been an advisor for 28 years. I'm here today with my colleague, Kathryn Wakefield. Kathryn is an attorney. She happens to work for Mass Mutual in the Advanced Planning Department. She's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in sociology and also has a law degree from Western New England University. She began as a financial advisor, so she knows a lot about this topic, and then also worked during law school for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and now helps financial advisors like me and our clients and business owner clients think about the complexities of planning. And this subject for today is one of those complex subjects. I do want to point out for those of you who are our clients on the call today, thank you. This topic came about because of you. Many of you, I would say over the last, 100 days at least, but over the last 6 months have asked the question, hypothetically speaking, if we were to think about possibly moving out of the country temporarily or permanently, what kind of things should we be thinking about? So simple question, complicated answer. And we decided to just take an hour and dedicate it to this subject today. So we're going to talk today. We want this to be somewhat conversational, but we also know that this is a pretty personal topic. And so given the fact that this is personal for many of you, here's a couple of things I'd like to just begin with. First and foremost, we're not going to have a political conversation. We're going to have an informative conversation today and try to keep politics out of this. But I also just think it's worth acknowledging why we're having this conversation and to just give a little love to all of us who've been impacted over the last 6 months and who feel perhaps not as comfortable as you once felt, whether it's for yourself, for your kids, for your community, and that the fact that you might even be considering leaving the country permanently or temporarily as a result of some of the things that have happened over the last few months speaks a lot to what you're going through. So I just want to empathize with what people are dealing with right now. It is a pretty loaded conversation too. So what we want to do is bring some facts to you. And because this is personal, what we're going to do is have Kathryn, she's going to present on the majority of this subject for today. If you have questions that you think probably pertain to the majority of people, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll kind of ask and answer questions as we go. But if you have a more personal question, we're going to go through about 45 minutes, then we're going to stop recording. And we're going to open it up to questions not on a recorded call. So if there's something that you would like to ask but not ask when this is being recorded, just save it till the end and we'll be able to get back to you. And as always, we have a whole series of webinars this year. This is 2 of 6. As always, if there's something that you don't want to ask on a recorded call or even a non-recorded call and just want to ask very personally, you can always reach out to us after the fact. So I'm always putting that out there to let you know that we're resources, both myself and Kathryn. Okay, so I'm going to open up Kathryn. Here's the subject, which is what do I need to know before moving outside of the United States? There's going to be a lot of facts and figures. There's going to be some heavy tax information as we talk about your money and what it means to leave and or come back. And so Kathryn has a series of slides that she's going to go through. Just know that after the call today, we're also going to send you those slides. So if it's easier for you to just kind of sit back, not have to take a lot of notes, but just be in this conversation with us, and then we'll send you all the information after the fact. That might just help you in the way that you approach the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Kathryn. She's a wealth of knowledge, but also, we've done a lot of these presentations together. She has been able to take some pretty complicated, heavy subject matter and just make it understandable for regular people to digest and then make some good informed decisions. So My friend, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll monitor the chat for you. So if anything comes up, I may interrupt you to help answer some questions for folks.
Please do. And thank you so much, Amy, for having me. Thank you all for being here. This is definitely a topic. Like Amy said, I work with her as well and her group, as well as other advisors across the country. And it is amazing the amount of questions I'm getting surrounding this topic. Some of it is work related, some of it is not work related, where clients move here for work, they're moving back to another country, or their company is transferring them. So we're seeing some of that, but we're also seeing some people that are, like Amy said, feeling some discomfort and weighing their options. So for whatever reason you're considering moving, let's talk about some of the things you want to think about first, and we'll go from there. So as Amy said, I work at Mass Mutual, so this is not designed to be tax or legal advice. This is designed to give you enough information that you feel more informed and you can go work with your own personal tax, financial, and legal advisors to continue the conversation. This is to get you started. So let's get a good start with level setting, and let's look at where we are from a U.S. tax perspective. So if you are currently on the call and you are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, that means you're here with a green card. From a U.S. estate tax perspective, you are taxed based on your citizenship. So as a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, all of your worldwide assets are subject to U.S. estate tax. That is true whether you live in the country or you don't live in the country. If you keep your U.S. citizenship or permanent residency, you are subject to the U.S. tax system. So currently, we've got an estate tax exemption at the federal level of $13.99 million. So for those of us who have that amount, I would love to be able to say that was me, but for those of us who have that amount, you multiply that by 2 if you have a married spouse, that's going to put you at about $28 million. That is subject to change for January 1st, 2026, and that is something that we are monitoring closely because that is supposed to drop based on the sunset for the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. That's supposed to end as of January 1st, 2026. What that means, if that happens, is the estate tax exemption drops back down to $5 million, indexed for inflation, so landing somewhere between 5 and 6 million. So what that means for all of us is that those of us who might not be subject to estate tax at this level might be subject to estate tax when it does drop or if it does drop. So this is something that we're watching very closely because that's been up for conversation. There are tax bills that have been proposed. I saw that on Stock Watch this morning, is that there's a bill forthcoming, so we'll be paying close attention. But right now, this is what we've got, and that's the situation we're in, is just the holding pattern of waiting. If you are both U.S. citizens, you can use an unlimited marital amount to transfer assets to your spouse at the first death. If your spouse is not a U.S. citizen, that's even if they're a green card holder, you can't do that. So you can only transfer up to that 13.99 amount, or if it drops, whatever it drops to your spouse. They look at the citizenship of the surviving spouse when it comes to this. So if you're married to a non-citizen and you pass away first, your spouse can only inherit up to the current exemption. If your spouse passes away first and the U.S. citizen is the survivor, they can inherit everything outright. So working with Amy, you guys can look at both scenarios and look at how to plan for both possibilities in a way that you wouldn't need to do if you're both U.S. citizens. So getting started with that's the landscape. If you keep your U.S. citizenship, no matter where you live in the world, you're going to follow the U.S. estate tax rules, as long as you keep your citizenship or permanent residency. Now, if you decide to become a non-resident alien, or you already are a non-resident alien, what that means is you are here, you do not pay taxes here, you're not a U.S. resident, you just live here. So for some people, they're here on a visitor visa, they're here on a student visa, people are here on an athlete visa, and they stay, but they're not subject to the U.S. tax system. That's what's called a non-resident alien, or NRA. NRAs are taxed differently than a citizen or permanent resident in that only their U.S. assets are subject to estate tax. So the good news and bad news, and sorry, that should say 2025, I found a typo. If you look at your own presentation enough times, you always miss something. So it's 2025, not 225. You get a $60,000 exemption. So with a US citizen, right, you are taxed on worldwide assets, but you get 13.99 million. If you're a non-resident alien, it's only $60,000. That exemption hasn't increased since the 80s, but you're only taxed on US assets. So if you choose to give up your citizenship and you move back, that's what your situation is going to look like until you redo your citizenship or residency in the US. You'll have that 60,000. So as you do your calculations with Amy and with your tax and legal professionals as to whether it makes sense to give up your citizenship if you do choose to move or retain your citizenship, you're going to look at that calculation of, well, if we leave, we get $60,000 if we leave assets behind. But we're only subject to US assets. So if we move most of our assets overseas and leave something behind, what does it look like? Versus we keep our citizenship and we get 13.99 million or whatever the estate tax changes to, but we're taxed on everything worldwide, whether we buy property somewhere else and just keep some assets here or rent outside of the US because we're not sure we're going to stay outside the US. There's a lot of what ifs, and there isn't one right answer. So that's the good news, right, folks? Is that the only right answer is the one that's right for your family. So you can choose to leave and get rid of your citizenship, but it's harder to come back and they change the exemption, or you can choose to keep everything status quo and just physically move, knowing that you're going to be taxed on everything you buy, whether it's inside the US or not. So, given those tax scenarios, right? Not even looking at income tax, because we will talk about that too, but that's just purely tax planning for your estate. What do you need to know before you move outside of the United States? First and foremost, you need to look at whether the tax laws are same in the new country you're going to move to and in the United States. So why do we need to know that? We need to look at the estate tax laws and we need to look at the income tax laws in both countries prior to your move. I say prior because nobody likes surprises, especially when you're working with a good financial planner. You don't want to give yourself or them any surprises. So what we're looking at is the tax laws in the US and how they're going to impact me if I move to another country. So, for example, life insurance and investments may be treated differently and taxed differently in the country that you're moving to versus what we have in the US, because life insurance and investments, such as your 401k or any other qualified plan, are based on US tax code. That does not translate to other countries. So, for example, if you move across the border to Canada, you can't just take your 401k and roll it into a Canadian RRSP, which is the equivalent of a 401k in Canada ish. You can't, because they're based on different tax code, they're not apples to apples. So you would have to actually take your 401k, liquidate it, pay the taxes, and then move to Canada, put those assets in a Canadian account. You couldn't just do a tax-free transfer. So again, just an example, something to think about. And then you also want to look at whether estate tax laws are the same and how your estate will be treated there versus here. And that leads into, do we have a tax treaty with the other country? The reason we want to know if the country you're moving to has a tax treaty is you're going to pay taxes in both countries if you retain a connection with the United States. No, not really an exception to that one, unfortunately. But what you're going to do is you're going to pay taxes in the other country. And then whatever you pay taxes on in the other country, if there's a tax treaty, will somewhat offset what you would owe in the US for maintaining that US connection, even though you don't live here. So you've got to look at what it's going to look like on in both countries and how it's going to impact you, one, from a filing perspective, and two, from just how much am I going to pay in taxes for making this change. So that flows nicely into, will my documents still work? Right? So powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, wills, trusts, all the documents that you've set up for yourselves here, if you have any of those. The question is, are the laws similar enough in the country that I'm moving to that those documents are still going to work? Because you're going to be applying US tax law and US estate law to, just my example before, to Canada. And are the Canadian laws similar enough that the US documents are going to work? Or are you going to have the Canadian legal system shaking their head trying to figure out how to make these US documents kind of fit square peg, round hole? So that's a great question to ask. And you're going to want to find a good tax and legal professional familiar with both countries' laws. So there are some big international estate planning firms, tax firms in the United States, like Ernst& Young, PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, that have a worldwide presence. That might be somebody you'd want to reach out to. But there's a lot more than that, just happens to be those are 2 that I've worked with in the past.
Kathryn, can you just address for a moment if someone decides to leave temporarily and is earning income in another country, but maybe also has US investments, capital gains still happening in the US? How does it work from like filing taxes?
Great question. You're going to file taxes in both countries. So you're going to file taxes first in the country that you don't live in. And I know that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but the reason you do that is you file your tax return or you set at least do your tax return in the country that you don't live in first. It's called an ancillary jurisdiction for those of you who want the legal term. And the reason that is because you need to know what the dollar amount is that you owe or the refund you're going to get in the United States. That gets transferred to your tax return in the country that you've moved to say, hey, I've already paid taxes on this. Because if I have $100 in capital gains in the US and I live in France, I'm going to have to report that $100 in capital gains on my French tax return and my US tax return. So in theory, I'm paying taxes on the same money twice. So I do the US tax return first, and then I'm going to file the French tax return and say, hey, by the way, I've already paid taxes on this hundreds of dollars in the United States. So let me take that amount off my French tax return. So you will do 2 sets of taxes, but you will have some offset as long as that country has a tax treaty with the US. How much the offset is, no idea, because each country is going to be different. And we're also going to be looking at currency fluctuations and
And
differences in tax percentage.
we had a situation like this a couple of years ago with clients who left the US and moved back home to Australia and were eligible for US Social Security and had pensions in the US and also had a pension in Australia. And so income is coming from 2 sources. Citizenship was ending in the US, but 2 CPAs, 2 estate planning attorneys, and 2 financial advisors to navigate the 2 countries. So, like, just know for anybody on this call or anybody listening to this recording, this is complicated and you want to get your team of professionals in order to make sure that every step of the way you're documenting what's happening and making sure you're taking into account money, where it's flowing from, and all the legal rules and regs from each of the countries.
Absolutely. And also important to that is you want to give yourself a runway. You want to get these professionals in place probably 6 months to a year before you move, because you want folks to get a handle on your estate planning documents, your legal documents, if you need to change ownership for anything, depending on what you're considering as far as the move and the country you're moving to and what you're leaving behind in the US as an asset. For example, if you're leaving real estate behind, you might not want to own it in your own name. You might want to protect yourself a little bit more from any creditor issues, someone that slips and falls on your property, especially if you choose to rent it out. And you might want to consider transferring your real estate into an LLC, at least talking to your attorney and your advisor about that. So that would take some time and that would take some doing. So you want to make sure that you have the time and you've left enough to, enough space before you actually physically pack up and go to have that discussion and have everything nailed down ahead of time so there are no surprises.
And I
Or at
think
least
too,
it's
just the conversation around citizenship and having a long enough runway, because none of these things happen as quickly as you'd want them to. So we've got clients right now applying for Canadian citizenship and would have thought it would have happened much more smoothly, but they've run into all kinds of interesting paperwork complications. They had hoped to have moved by now, and they just can't. So if you're thinking about it, you can't start soon enough, but also be patient about how many details are entailed in this process.
And I have also heard that you have to sometimes go to the country of origin or the country you're moving to in person to file certain amounts of paperwork. So you have to take that into account too. Is all right, what do we actually need to do to make this happen from a travel perspective? But that's a mess when it doesn't go as smoothly as you expect,
Right.
especially if you've got people waiting for you, jobs waiting for you, et cetera. So yeah, leave as much time as you possibly can. And I know it's not always that simple, right? We'd love to be able to say, give yourself a year, but if something happens where you get transferred and they're like, you were moving in 3 weeks, it's like 3 weeks, here we go, right? But knowing these things need to all happen as soon as possible kind of gives you that start of, okay, well, I have this time. I'm going to use it as best as I can. Hopefully, most of you get more time than that. The other piece is, can you continue to work with the people in the US once you're outside of the United States? And this is a question you need to ask each and every one of the professionals that you'd like to keep working with, right? Amy's spot on. You need to have a team in both countries that are going to continue to work together to help you with the move and help you moving forward. But you also want to ask the folks that in the country that you're leaving behind, can you continue to work with me if I'm not inside the US anymore? And if not, what do I need to know or what do I need to make put in place to make that possible? So for example, CPAs, attorneys, advisors tend to be licensed in the United States. Most people are not licensed outside. So if you've got a securities professional you're working with, they're not going to be able to take your phone call from overseas and make a trade on your behalf because that would be trading outside of their securities license. So you're going to need a US person left in the United States that's going to make that call for you as one possibility, but getting that set up in place as well as a process for how you're going to manage any assets left behind is going to be an important piece as well. And then if you are keeping the assets in the US, how are you going to own them? And part of that goes to how you're going to access those. If they're long-term investments where you're really not doing anything with them very often, you're not actively day trading, it's not something you need to access on a daily basis, that power of attorney might be your best bet. Or maybe looking at a trust or looking at putting an LLC together, or do we move those assets outside of the US? Especially if this may be a temporary move. There's the scorched earth approach, which is I'm moving absolutely everything no matter what it takes and removing all assets from the US. I have seen people do that and then they get transferred back and they're like, oh, whoops, that probably wasn't the best choice. So for a lot of people, they're testing out, it might be a better option to test out the other location, make sure that's a location you want to stay in permanently, and then start to move your assets over in a more thoughtful fashion than just, hey, we're moving, we're taking everything with us. And there's some tax consequences, of course, to that too, especially if you're moving qualified plans or other investments that you might have to sell because then you'll incur some gains and potentially pay some tax. So speaking of citizenship, right? This is the big question, right? This is the big one. So the big question here is, do I keep my citizenship or not? If it's going to be a temporary move, right? To Amy's point, if this is a temporary move and you think you're coming back, it's probably going to be your better option, given the amount of paperwork on both sides to give it up than get it back, to just retain your US citizenship, knowing that you've got that estate tax exemption, knowing that you're going to pay taxes in both places, and you're going to have more paperwork to do that, but it's going to be a little bit more flexible than if you just say, I'm out and give away everything and figure out how to get rid of your citizenship. They made some changes. US government made some changes in 2008 because what was happening before that is people were moving outside of the US, and to avoid paying any taxes and bring their assets, they were leaving everything to their kids, their friends, their family members as gifts. And then those friends and family members were just gifting them back when the person got settled in the other country. Made perfect sense. But Congress saw that and went, wait a second, we have a problem. So hence the HART Act, Heroes Earnings Assistance Relief and Tax Act of 2008 brought two new code sections just because we needed more code sections. So we're at 877A and 2801 joined the US tax code. And I know we're well past 2008, but we wanted to give you a little bit of the history of that one because it's not that out of the ordinary that you might hear from some folks that have expatriated before 2008 that are like, oh, I didn't have to worry about that. I gave away this and I just got it back later. Well, you guys are past that, so we don't have that option. So let's look at what does happen with this exit tax that you might run into. The first thing that you might run into with this exit tax is that it's a one-time exit tax on a citizen or a permanent resident. So what happens here is that they look at your assets, entire ownership of assets that you own in your name, and they're all taxed as if they had been sold. So this is an important as if they had been sold because you're not being asked to liquidate all of your assets, but you are going to pay taxes as if you had. So it's just an important distinction I want to make. They're not saying to leave, you have to liquidate everything in cash and take it with you. You don't get an exclusion for gain on your personal residence. So if your house has a significant amount of gain built into it because you've owned it for a long time, that's going to count towards this dollar amount. Now, what they're looking for is they're looking for the big fish. They're looking for the people who have made a significant amount of money in the US and then are just going to leave. For one reason or another, they're leaving. They're going to look at net gain, and this is gain on all of your assets over 890,000, and that's index for 2025. So that amount goes up a little bit every single year with inflation. So they're not looking to catch most people. They're looking to catch the multimillionaires that are leaving with a significant amount of assets and a significant amount of gain built into their portfolios and real estate. So it's 890,000 index for inflation, and that's the gain, that's not total assets. They're also going to put some income and net worth limitations on it. You get this lovely title of a covered expatriate. And it sounds wonderful and it just rolls off the tongue nicely, but it's not a great position to be in. Yeah, maybe it is because you've got some finances to move, so that's not so bad. Might not be so bad after all, but it just means you have to pay more attention to these rules. You need to have an average 5-year income tax liability of over 206,000. Again, that gets indexed every year. You need a net worth of 2 million or more. That's a flat amount. That doesn't change. And you must have paid all of your taxes, or you must certify that you haven't quite paid all of your taxes yet. One or the other. But if you fall under this covered expatriate rules, if you have all of that gain built in and you say, I'm giving up my citizenship, you're going to pay a significant amount of tax for the privilege of giving up your citizenship. Anybody want to take a guess in the chat as to why they're doing that? I'll give you a few seconds to see if anyone wants to be brave and just answer that one. Believe me, I won't be offended if nobody does.
So far, you have no takers.
All right. Well, then I'm picking on you, Amy. Why do you think why do you think they're doing this?
Why the tax itself?
Yes,
Well, I mean, it's just a huge disincentive.
absolutely. And if you move, you're going to die somewhere else, right? These are the folks that are potentially subject to
The
estate
estate
tax.
tax. Yep.
So they're looking at this and saying, well, we're going to get our taxes one way or the other. You're welcome to move, but we're going to tax you based on as if you had died, because we're
Interesting.
not going to get your tax later on. So
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. Just a question
yeah,
came
no,
up that this
please.
might be a good time to ask, which is, how does this work for someone who already is a dual citizen? So let's say someone is a US and Ireland citizen and decides to move to Ireland. How is that different than someone who's thinking about a different residency?
It's a great question. So most countries you're supposed to swear loyalty to both countries above all, which, as you might guess, does not work, right? So you are a US citizen. When you're on US citizen property, if you're on US soil, you are a US citizen first, Irish citizen second. If you're in Ireland, you're an Irish citizen first, US citizen second. So in theory, both countries respectively hold their noses and ignore the fact that you have dual citizenship. And they say, when you're on our land, you are ours. When you are not, you belong to the other country first. So the way that's going to work is if somebody keeps both citizenships, there we go, tripping over my tongue. It's not going to change much of anything because the person who's been the dual citizen, if they have income in the other country all along, has already been filing these taxes, has likely encountered some of these things that we mentioned earlier of needing to file in both places, wondering about a tax treaty. Where that's going to change is if they do decide to give up that US citizenship and maintain the Irish one.
Got it. So it matters where you live while you're earning money, and it matters where you die when you have money.
Yes,
Got
that is a very good way to put it.
In
All right, we're
summary.
done here. Amy just summed that up perfectly. Yes, absolutely. That's what we need to know. And the more money you have, the more the governments are respectively going to take a look at this and potentially audit your estate.
You should,
And this
Catherine,
is
Catherine, we should have just titled this, "This is a life and death conversation."
I love it. I absolutely love it. Yes, I think that will be our new title for if we get to do this one again. I think I'm going to change that. Perfect. All right. Speaking of life and succession, Section 2801. This is for folks that are dealing with being covered expatriates. Remember, I said that a lot of folks that were finding themselves in this situation were choosing to leave things to friends or family member or somebody in the US so they didn't have to count it and pay the taxes. Well, along with that 877A exit tax came this section where they said, oh, wait a second, we figured out that loophole. We're going to make anybody who's a U.S. citizen or resident or a U.S. trust that gets gifts or bequests from those covered expatriates actually pay taxes. If they left after 2008, they're going to pay tax at the top estate tax rate based on that year of transfer, which 2025, it's a 40% tax. You do, as the recipient, get $19,000 annual exclusion against all gifts from these, quote, covered expatriates. But this is the one and one time only that a U.S. resident is going to pay as the recipient of a gift. Usually the way gift tax works is you're paying as the giver, not as the recipient. But here, for example, we've got John, who's a U.S. resident, receives a gift of 19 grand from his mom, and then his dad passes away and leaves him 100,000. Because mom and dad were covered expatriates, John now owes $40,000.
Which is the 40% tax on the 100,000, but not on the $19,000 original gift.
Exactly. So you have that leeway, but this is the only time that you're going to pay taxes as receiving an inheritance or receiving a gift, unless you have an inheritance tax in your state or in the country that you move to. So it's something to be careful of, something to think about. If you've got family members and you're moving assets around as you're leaving, this could be something where if you fall into this covered expatriate role, you're actually giving your friends and family members a tax bill along with their gift. So something to talk with your planners about, your tax professionals, et cetera, everybody. Something to talk with everybody about because these are important questions to ask. And if your family has moved and you're following them and they've moved since 2008, this is a great question to ask if they say, hey, I'm going to give you this amount of money. You want to ask them, hey, by the way, when you left, did you fall under these rules? Did you pay an exit tax? Because if they did, then you need to know that there's a tax bill due when they send you a gift, if it's over that 19,000. So one of those strange things to be aware of that you wouldn't normally run into, but with this citizenship, you will. So a funny story. Many of you may remember back to 2016 and 2020, maybe even every election since I've been old enough to vote, somebody's been unhappy with the outcome, right? That's as much politics as I'll give you. But there's always a celebrity that says, I'm leaving. I'm leaving the United States. I'm unhappy with this. I'm moving, right? 99.9% of those folks are still here. And why do you think that is? It's because their CPA called them after they made that pronouncement on TV and said, that's lovely, but by the way, 877A is going to come bite you in the butt because you're going to pay taxes on your millions and millions and millions of dollars for the privilege of leaving and giving up your citizenship. Are you sure you want to do that? Well, they're all still here, so they probably answered no to that. But it's, You guys will laugh. Now, every time you see an election cycle go through, you guys are going to think 877A, I'm sure. And you're going to think about that celebrity who you see on TV who says, I'm leaving. That doesn't. And that's because of these rules and the CPAs and tax professionals behind the scenes that are saying, ooh, you might really want to think about this one. So, again, just kind of a funny story as you guys watch news coverage. So, what do I want you to think about? And I really want you to talk with your current tax and legal professionals. We want you to talk with your financial advisor, your tax professional, your legal professional, anybody that's on your trusted advisor team in the United States. Have them help you find somebody abroad that you can work with, or somebody in the US that has a really good knowledge base of the country that you're considering moving to. Because we do want to look at what the consequences are for the professionals you want to retain relationships with in the US, otherwise known as getting that power of attorney in place, making sure everything's up to date so your folks can still continue to work with you, and figuring out what the rules of engagement are. You can't make that last minute phone call of, I need this, because that's not possible from a foreign entity or from a foreign location. And you also want to look at, are my estate tax documents up to date? Have I done my estate planning? So when is the last time I looked at my power of attorney? If you're doing if you're moving overseas and you're keeping a US power of attorney, digital assets is something that is going to be incredibly important for you because you're going to do a lot of things with your US accounts online. And you're going to want your US power of attorney to be able to do the same. So what a digital asset is it's your online footprint. This is your email, social media, online bill pay, photo share, cryptocurrency, anything that you have an online password for. You want to look and make sure that's in your power of attorney document because you're going to need that for somebody to do things on your behalf when you're outside of the US. You need them to be able to access your online bill pay. If you don't have those digital assets language in your current documents, it may be something to talk with your attorney about because if you don't have them, there's the possibility that the person is going to go have to petition Google to get into your Gmail and petition Facebook or Meta to get into your social media accounts. And cryptocurrency is just non-existent at that point. If you don't have the code, you just don't get in. But without having that language in writing, it's much harder for the person you've named to help you out to be able to actually do the things you're asking them to do. So just having that in place is going to be really important. And then looking at your current estate documents, does anything change because you're moving? Are you leaving a house here? Are you selling a house? Does your current estate plan still work? And is it the way you want it structured, even if you're leaving the United States? So, does it take into account the fact that you just bought a house in France or you just bought a house somewhere or a property? If that's not listed in your document, you may want to say, hey, by the way, we need to update this because I'm moving to account for the fact that I now have a foreign asset. And then talking to an attorney in the country that you're moving to say, by the way, I'm leaving assets in the US. I now need to do my documents in this country that I'm moving to, and then make sure I mention a US asset. So that way you've got reciprocity between the two countries because we don't know how different the tax sections and the estate planning laws are going to be in each country.
We've got three really interesting questions,
Awesome.
all
Have at
all
it.
totally different. Okay, so
Love it.
first from Carrie is, all right, forget moving out of the US, but what if somebody just says, I want to start moving money out of the US? I want to start investing outside of the US. How does that work?
That is a great question. So, if you're going to still live here, there's no issue with investing outside of the US. You can set up foreign investment accounts. You will still need to talk with a professional in that country to see how the ownership structure works. Not every country is going to allow you to have an investment account as a foreign individual because if you're investing, I'm just going to say Canada, if you're investing in Canada, and you want to set up a Canadian account, you may need to have an address in Canada that they can send mail to show that you're based in Canada, at least part time. The US requires that. So many other countries may as well. So you just want to see what the requirements would be. You may have to set up a trust or a business entity that would then own the accounts in the foreign country, and you would own that entity here, but it's going to be a little bit of a process. You can't just call a Sun Trust or a company that's worldwide and open an account in another country.
And if somebody wanted to move $200,000 of cash to Switzerland, I'm totally making this up. And then there's gain on that money. How does the gain work if you're a US citizen versus living somewhere else?
So we are going to push that back to their CPA.
Good
And
answer.
there's
Okay.
the official answer. But
Okay.
I would say they're gonna wanna plan for that in advance because
Okay.
there is if they're moving assets in kind or if it's just cash getting moved to a foreign account, there are gonna be know your customer rules in both countries where they're gonna have to file the forms. There are US forms you have to file each year. It's actually called a 3520 that says that you have foreign accounts and that you may be receiving money from those accounts. So there's a bunch more tax filings that you're gonna need to do for having foreign assets, so just preparing for that on both sides makes sense.
Got
Because
it.
now actually Switzerland's a great example because they used to have very good privacy laws where nobody knew who had what. They got through that, so now it's more of an open book, so you are gonna have to disclose everything.
Gotcha. All right. Next question is, how does Social Security work if you move abroad?
So Social Security is an interesting one because you've earned it, you're entitled to it. You should still receive your Social Security check as long as you've met your 40 quarters. If there is a foreign if let's say you go work in a country that has an equivalent program or a nationwide pension program that's similar to Social Security, and you work another 10 years in that other country. So now you're eligible for Social Security and the other country's pension program. The two may offset each other, but you would be eligible in theory for both. There's a Social Security calculator on the SSA.gov website that has the ability to let you put in some of these different scenarios. So that would be a great thing to go through with Amy and with your tax professionals before you do it to see how that would affect you, especially if the country you move to, you're planning on working in.
And then the next question that came up is, this is an interesting one. What happens if you have long-term care insurance and you move to a foreign country?
That is a very good one because long-term care is based on US care.
Yep.
So that may be something that doesn't translate. That's going to be one where you want to look at the specific policy you bought and see whether that carrier will pay out in a foreign country, because that's not a guarantee because that's based on US code.
Yep. Typically, the answer is no on that, but we do know that from experience. But again, always ask the carrier.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Wow, very good questions. Very different ones. You're right, but very good questions.
And I think too, one of the other things that has come up a number of times in the last few months with some of our clients is the plan to move, the plan to buy real estate in a different country, and the mechanism through which you're going to buy it. So, or the which assets are you going to use to buy it? So we just had a client who's thinking about moving to Canada and found a home and found a Canadian banker and found a way to get a mortgage. And so has been working between the two countries. But the Canadian banker suggested that he take $1 million out of his US 401k to buy the house. And the Canadian advisor did not understand the tax implication to taking money out of the 401k in the US, paying ordinary income on it, and not being 59 and a half and paying a 10% penalty. So the client's thinking, I've got $1 million I could put towards this as part of our retirement plan, but didn't realize that the million minus the taxes minus the penalty would net him about 500,000. So, we want to be thinking about not just the concept of moving, but the logistics of where are the dollars coming from to get you there. And so, Kathryn, you mentioned renting versus owning, right? It might just be baby steps first before making it such a gigantic financial commitment.
Absolutely, because you just don't know what to expect. You might think the idea of moving to the country you're planning to is a wonderful idea, and it turns out not to be quite so wonderful. So, and I started looking at different stories as we were talking as we were getting ready for today, and I saw a town in Italy that was offering €1 homes, right?
They
You
sure
see
were.
those advertised every so often, and I was like, "Wow, what a cool idea." But there's actually a movie made about somebody that does this, that moves to and buys one of these houses and what it actually costs to make this €1 home livable and what it's like moving to another country to try to renovate and so there's a lot to it. It's a really cool idea, but it's definitely requires a lot of planning. And and then the piece of do you keep your citizenship or do you not is the other piece of planning because it's like, what's the likelihood that you're going to ever come back to the US? And do
Well,
you want to leave that door open?
and it's such an interesting topic because, you just said you never know. And, we had friends who lived in London and were planning on staying in London, and the parents are still in the US, and everything was great until the first grandbaby was born. And then they wanted to be closer to family. So the idea of living abroad was great until a baby was born, and then everything changed. The whole family dynamics changed because they wanted to be closer to family and came back to the US. So interesting, you never know where your life is going to go and what things may come up that were just unexpected that would change your perspective. I know in this moment, this is a very delicate subject and one that's pretty emotional for people. But if you could imagine fast forwarding 5 or 10 years, it's hard to know where your mind will be in that moment of what your priorities are.
Absolutely. And that's such a huge statement, right? That's such a big deal what you just said because it really is short shorter term possible,
Right.
right? It things could change where you would want to come back. And if you do go that scorched earth method and give up your citizenship and leave, it's a lot harder to return and get your US citizenship back than it is to maintain it. And just the process is a much longer process. If you want to leave that other country and come back, it could be months, maybe even years to get back into the US. So it's versus if you kept your citizenship and then looking at those tax structures of, okay, we've got 13.9 per person versus 60,000. What's going to make the most sense for me and my family is going to be something where even once you're outside of the US, you need to stay up to date on the US estate tax if you keep your citizenship, because if it drops, let's say back to $1 million, the way it used to be, maybe now it's time to give up your citizenship because maybe now it doesn't make sense to keep it. So there's a lot. It's going to be a planning process, just like the rest of the planning has been when you live in the US. So just continuing to work with your advisor and stay in contact with your advisors in both countries is going to be really important.
Steve had asked the question about a tax-free exchange of real estate. So, in the US, we can do
You have a
1031 exchanges.
1031.
Yep. What about foreign purchases of real estate?
So you can't, because it's based on US tax code, Steve, I'm not 100% certain, but because it's a US tax code section that allows for that tax-free exchange, anytime there's a foreign law that comes into play, it's not going to be exactly the same as the US. So it would be my gut says you're not going to be able to exchange a US asset for a US piece of real estate for a foreign piece of real estate tax-free the way you would using a 1031 exchange and going US to US. But that's something we do. That's something I could follow up with Amy on and get you an official answer and and find out for you.
Great question. Any other questions that anyone has to put in the chat before we stop recording? And then we'll take our last 10 minutes of non-recorded time to ask any other questions. Let me just pause for a moment to see if anyone has a chat